Morning. It's great to see all of you here. So at Huawei, we started our open source journey quite a number of years ago. Back in 2006 was when Huawei engineers first started engaging in open source, but it took about 3 years before we started shipping products. And so there was a 3-year journey between the first engagement of open source, where we just started to use it actively, all the way up until it first started to appear in the commercial products that we started to ship. So there were two big events and big major product lines across Huawei that has really driven a lot of the adoption for open source at the company. And I want to use these two areas to sort of trace what has been the journey of Huawei through open source and how are we looking at open source as we go forward. So in 2009, Huawei shipped our first Android phone. So of course, Android is an open source mobile operating system. And this was the very first product that we shipped from Huawei that had a major open source component in it. The following year, Huawei announced that we were going to create an entirely new business category within the company and enter into the enterprise space as well as into the cloud computing space. Now, up until this time, the business at Huawei had been primarily focused just on the networking and carrier business. So, of course, Huawei had spent a lot of money investing to build out a lot of the 3G and 4G networks of the time. But back in 2010, Huawei also announced that we were going to form a new business focused on enterprise computing, and the root of this was going to be built on top of open technologies. So I want to use this framework to sort of trace what has been Huawei doing across open source and how has that evolved across the company back from those very early days in 2006 all the way to where we currently are from an open source standpoint. So I'm going to talk a little bit about 3 different elements: using open source as components within the products that we offer, shifting more towards looking at open source as a fundamental business proposition in terms of how do we actually drive commerce, and then ultimately, how are we trying to connect using open source. So let's start off with components. So I mentioned before that one of the big instigators for Huawei in terms of how we started to become involved in open source was really this journey towards embracing enterprise computing and cloud computing. Now, if you know anything about the state of open source today, of course, the vast majority of open source technologies are all oriented around the enterprise space. And so when Huawei started to engage in enterprise business in our company, we started our first journey across seriously engaging with open source. So we started doing our own R&D around cloud computing in 2008. And then about 4 years later, we launched our first private cloud business. This was our Fusion Sphere and now our Fusion Cloud suite of products. This has grown very quickly to become the largest private cloud offering in the China market today. And then we continued to evolve our technologies until a few years earlier, we launched in conjunction with many of our telco partners in the world, a co-run set of public clouds. So working with partners here in Europe, such as Deutsche Telekom and Orange and Telefonica, we launched a worldwide set of public cloud resources and then followed that up with our own Huawei Cloud branded infrastructure. Now we've launched that internationally. Huawei Cloud for us has become the fastest growing public cloud in the China market, and we are quickly expanding overseas as well. And all these things, whether it's from our private cloud technologies or our public cloud, we are building entirely on an open source technology stack. So I mentioned before that a lot of Huawei's open source journey has been a direct result of our participation of these technologies and driving our participation in open source. So ever since those very early days where Huawei started to engage in cloud computing, we have become one of the largest contributors in the world to open source across all the different major open source foundations. Whether this is at Linux Foundation or at OpenStack Foundation or CNCF or in Apache and so on, Huawei has become one of the top sponsors and one of the top contributors overall to open source. And this is all largely driven by the fact that we are building out these enterprise businesses now at the company. And so this has been a major journey in terms of how Huawei has started to adopt open source, but also started to participate and contribute back to the broader open source environment and community. But this is, for me, just a first continuing journey, because the next evolution across the company started a few years back when we started to say, there's a new wave of computing that is starting to arise that is going to come after cloud computing. Cloud computing is not going to go away, but the nature of cloud is going to fundamentally change. And we need to start to think about what do we want to do from an open source standpoint and from a business standpoint to really bet the company in terms of where we're going to go from the future. And there's been two big trends that we've been looking at in terms of what is going to shape the investment that we do around open source and what is going to shape the direction of the technology of the company. Now, the first thing, and this is obviously a very, very hot topic for most of the world today, but was around artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies. If you look at most of the workload projections over the next 5 years, machine learning and artificial intelligence is estimated to consume about 80% of our data center capacity within 5 years, as we take a look at across all the different clouds that are going to be run across the world. This is primarily because machine learning is incredibly compute intensive, and it is also incredibly data intensive. So that stresses both your storage as well as networking components in terms of what you're going to do. This is going to require a total change in terms of what does the hardware architecture look like across all these cloud data centers, all the way up to what do the software and service stacks look like. So this is one big change that has been informing a lot of how Huawei is starting to plan our future open source activities. The other big change that has been driving a lot of our strategy has been the fact that now, as we look at how do we start to bring out these compute capabilities pervasively into everywhere, workloads are not going to exist just in a centralized cloud data center. We can already see how quickly powerful our mobile devices have become. We're starting to see the rise of edge clouds. And as we see all these different things, we've been looking at in the past, how do we start to take cloud computing technologies from the data center and push them out towards the edge? But we also see a reverse of that happening, where now, because we have such powerful devices living at the edge, and we need to bring artificial intelligence everywhere, and we need a consistent platform to go across devices and edge and cloud, we're going to see a bi-directional exchange of technology, where we have uniform technologies also coming from our devices back into the cloud. And so this has been really driving a lot of the thinking from what we've been doing at Huawei. And so the strategy that we are pursuing now from an open source standpoint is how do we start to create a fundamentally new platform that allows you to write your applications and provide pervasive intelligence everywhere that you are, whether across your mobile devices, whether they go across the cloud, and whether they go across an edge data center. In order to do that, we need to have a total re-architecture from the hardware all the way up to the software layer, and Huawei is going to do every single layer of this in the open. Let me talk a little bit about what we are going to do, just a few highlights because we don't have time to go over everything. Now, I want to start from the hardware standpoint because if we're going to start to focus on the fact that machine learning workloads are going to consume 80% of our cloud data centers in the future, this is starting to drive a lot of new heterogeneous hardware architectures. So we're moving from a world where you could just have one processor, general purpose processor, that could drive everything that you're doing from the cloud to a proliferation of different computing chips. So everything from GPUs to tensor neural processing units. You've got different kinds of ARM chips and x86 chips, FPGAs, and so on. A lot of the focus that we've been driving at Huawei is how do we start to take a lot of the mobile chips, especially those of ours powered by the ARM processing architecture, and scale them into the data center in a very, very efficient way. This provides two key benefits. The first is that we can provide a consistent hardware architecture for running all your AI workloads from your mobile devices all the way into the data center without any application or even compilation changes. So a consistent architecture to drive across that. But also, as your workloads become increasingly machine and data-oriented, the ARM architecture in our Kumpung processing line provides a lot of efficiencies, both from a power standpoint and from a performance standpoint in terms of how do we engage across these new workloads of the future. So the first foundation that we've been building on is this new processing architecture to provide consistency. Our Kumpung line, which is ARM-powered and uses the exact same capabilities from our mobile devices all the way out to the cloud data centers. The second chipset that we've been focused on is what we call our Ascend line. Because if you're going to have machine learning workloads dominate your workloads of the future, you're going to want to have specialized hardware, both from a machine learning training standpoint and from a machine learning inference standpoint, in order to be able to compute these different workloads. And so we have created what is the industry's fastest NPU in the market today, for both training and for inference. If we take a look both from a power efficiency standpoint, we can scale our processors down to very, very small form factors, again, because we want to bring AI capabilities everywhere, whether it's in your mobile phone, whether it's an ear device that you can wear as a hearable, or all the way out to a massive cloud data center. Our NPUs are both incredibly power efficient and also extremely high performance. But in order to be able to deliver on these new hardware architectures, you also need to build out the software stack that goes on top of this. And so, for example, one of the things that we've been doing from an artificial intelligence standpoint is we've created a new machine learning framework that we call MindSport. MindSport has a number of benefits that we start to bring to a lot of the developers creating a lot of these machine learning frameworks and machine learning workloads. When you take MindSport, for example, and you run it on top of our Ascend processing units, we can achieve about double the performance of what you can achieve with all the other open source machine learning frameworks on a typical GPU or TPU on the market today. So extremely fast performance compared to other solutions that are on the market. One of the things that we're excited about MindSport is that we will be open sourcing this in Q1 of next year. So this is about to come out. It's not just MindSport, though. We really need to focus up and down the stack from an overall cloud architecture in terms of what is going to be this new technology stack that is going to enable artificial intelligence to become pervasive everywhere. And so what we've been focused on at Huawei is how do we start to make this entirely brand new stack available and in the open. So we start with the CPU architectures that I spoke about, our Ascend and our Kumpung processors. One of the things that we're doing at Huawei that is unique in the industry is that we are not just locking these processors into our own cloud. If you take a look at most of the other ARM and AI processors in the market, they're restricted primarily to one single vendor's public cloud. We will make these available for anyone to use. So we have an open architecture and an open hardware platform. On top of that, every single software stack that we're building, we are going to do in open source. And so we believe that this is the best way to drive an open and a neutral and a transparent and a safe machine learning stack for everyone to use, is to do this all entirely in open source. And so from the operating system all the way up to how do you deal with your database layer, all the way up into how do you deal with your AI frameworks, this is all going to be done in open source. So this is half the equation, because this only allows you to say, how do I start to build up these machine learning stacks and machine learning workloads across my data center? But if you remember, I also said we need to bring AI everywhere and to make it pervasive. And that means we need to start to spread these capabilities onto different devices, both at the edge and across your IoT devices as well. And so this has been at the heart of what Huawei has also been doing around a brand new operating system that we've created called Harmony OS. Harmony OS has two distinct features that really separate it from a lot of the other operating systems out in the market today. The first is that this is built on top of a microkernel architecture, so it has an extremely, extremely tiny footprint. We can run it on the lightest weight devices, whether it's a watch or a TV or a set of speakers, anything out there, we're able to run on this with a very minimal footprint. The other unique thing about Harmony OS, though, is that we can start to distribute this across multiple physical objects and virtualize them into one single device. This allows us to create a device that can start to bring your intelligence everywhere without having to round trip your data back into the cloud. This is especially important from a security and from a privacy standpoint. So for example, I could create one device that says, my television is the display for this device. My smart speakers are the audio input. My keyboard is the physical input. Or my drone is my camera. All this is just a very localized, distributed device with extremely low latency connectivity across everything, across a distributed virtualized bus. That means my data always stays local to me, is always protected, and is extremely efficient and extremely safe. This allows me to bring AI everywhere in a very efficient manner, and this is how we are starting to bring out AI not just into a machine learning workload capability in the data center, but how do we start to bring this across everything that you're doing? And so we think that this is going to be the largest, perhaps the largest contribution from a single vendor into open source in terms of what we are starting to do over the next year. I haven't had time to talk through all the different new technologies, but it's very, very pervasive and a big, big investment. And this is why I talk about this as really betting the company and betting the company's commerce and business in terms of what we're doing. We're shifting from open source just being the core components of what we're doing to being really building the next generation of our business at the company. Now, there's just one final thing I want to talk quickly about from an open source standpoint, because we see open source as playing a critical role, not just in terms of how do we build technology components, not just in terms of how do we start to build our own company's business, but really, as a force for how do we start to interact with each other in this world. I think it's no surprise that technology, wherever you live in the world today, has become, a very, very, big topic in the news. And a lot of the topics have to do with, are we going to be able to remain, connected across single standards? Are different countries going to implement policies around digital sovereignty? Are different vendors going to have to start to create different solutions for different markets? This is something that every single technology vendor around the world is going to have to wrestle with as we go forward. And this is where I also believe that open source, especially open source here in Europe, can play a very, very critical role in the overall global economy. Because as we take a look at what is happening across all the things that are happening from a technology standpoint between all these different regions in the world, the fact that Europe is viewed around the world as a willing and able and capable partner, as a technology innovator where there's incredible amounts of research that are happening, and also where open source is becoming increasingly important. Open source in Europe is something that we feel very strongly can become a way that how we collaborate around technology going forward into the future, no matter what happens from a trade standpoint. So one of the things, just to back that up from a Huawei perspective, is that we are shifting our open source investment to strategically prioritize and target Europe in terms of doing a disproportionate amount of our own open source development here in Europe as a way to facilitate this global connectivity around everything that we're doing. Just one recent example across this, as I'm sure many of you are aware, Eclipse Foundation is one of the strongest open source foundations with a presence here in Europe with very strong staff and operations and projects. And so just a couple months ago, Huawei upped our level of participation into Eclipse to the highest strategic level member. And we encourage many of you to join us participating in Eclipse Foundation, but also many of the other European open source agencies, because we think that as long as we can work together from an open source standpoint, we can still have this global collaboration in terms of how do we build these next generations of technology together. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bryan.